folks, and welcome to Forensic Anthropology. Today, we're just going to mostly talk about the basics and sort of what forensic anthropology is all about. A lot of you probably have a lot of misconceptions about physical anthropology and forensics, particularly. Forensic anthropology is, I hate to say it, not really what you see on TV. We do some of the things that you'll see on things like bones, but truth is most of that is make believe. In fact, I often say bones is to actual physical anthropology or forensic anthropology that's almost the same as like Star Trek is to the Apollo program. It's very different, but some of the things are grounded in reality. So we're going to talk a little bit about what we do, how we do it, and why we do it, and what exactly forensic anthropology is supposed to be all about. So I'm going to start by talking a little bit about what it means and then go into a little bit about the history of forensic anthropology. Forensics specifically means that it deals with medical legal issues. That is, issues of the body, the medico part, that are used in a case. That is the legal part. Here's what I'm trying to get across. Have you guys ever seen, I'm sure, certainly you have you ever seen, they say we're going to do a forensic examination of the King Tut mummy, or we're going to do a forensic examination of Billy the Kid? Truth is, that ain't forensics. That's something called paleopathology. Here's the difference. Nobody's going to jail. If they find out what happened to King Tut, let's just say he was in fact poisoned. Big deal. Whoever would have done it died over 3,000 years ago. He's not about to be arrested or anything like that. So the bottom line is forensics means that we are using all of the tools at our disposal to find out as much as we can about a body that is involved in a legal case. In other words, trying to figure out whether or not the individual was murdered and whether or not who that individual was. We can find out who they were based on their bodies and any other information that we can glean from the skeleton. Most of what we're working with is the skeleton. Fundamentally, we're just working with bones and teeth in certain situations. But because of the legal ramifications, because somebody's going to jail, it steps out of the realm of paleopathology, which basically means things that went wrong in ancient peoples, into a legal area. So we have additional conditions, such as we must maintain a chain of possession or chain of custody. That means if I get given a skull on my desk at my work and they say, here, figure this out, the officer or detective or medical examiner who leaves that bag that says evidence across the top, when they drop it off, they have to sign their name on the bag and say what time they dropped it off and into whose possession, at which point I put my name on the bag and say I took possession of this bag at 12:46 a.m. on, I don't know, Tuesday, November 3rd. So that's extremely important. And we saw what happens if the chain of possession or chain of custody is not well maintained in things like the O.J. Simpson case, in which case the gloves and knife and some other objects that were not well kept. In fact, the DNA evidence was put into question because it was not always in somebody's possession. Chain of possession has a lot of other little things to it that we'll go into much later on. Contamination. Contamination means basically getting your fingerprints, your DNA, your saliva, your hair, your carpet fibers, whatever, onto something. Contamination is strongly avoided. In other words, we close off a crime scene. We police that crime scene. We have cops outside the crime scene at all times while it's under investigation. so that the crime scene does not get contaminated. We do the same with all of the body parts and everything else, in an attempt to keep it from contamination. Obviously, that goes into things like DNA. Particularly involve the identity and what happened to the deceased. That's really our driving force. That's what forensic anthropologists do more than anything else, is find out the identity of the victim and find out what happened to the victim. And we'll go into a lot of detail about trauma and exactly how we determine whether it was homicide, suicide, or an accident, or some unknown force, or natural causes that killed this individual. But there's a lot of little idiosyncrasies and little tweaks that go into it as well. Scientific evidence has gone through a lot of changes. That which we use in forensics has started with a Bertillon style, especially in physical anthropology or forensic anthropology. Bertillon was the one who, he's obviously a Frenchman, who sort of worked out a method of judging who the person was based on their measurements. And we'll talk about that in a few minutes. Fry, which was a case in which the medical legal system, the whole forensic system, was put kind of under scrutiny, and then even more so in the Daubert standard, which happened in the 1990s, and they kind of re-scrutinized everything. And we'll talk about Fry versus Daubert later on and how that all works out. Identification comes in a lot of different ways. There's presumptive ID and there's positive ID. You've all heard of things like positive ID, dental records, prosthetics, which is like a fake arm or fake limb or even a plate or something else that's put into the body that isn't natural. X-rays that were taken before death, antemortem X-rays, things like the frontal sinuses and unique bone formations, as well as any abnormalities. Then there's something called presumptive ID, where we think we know who we've got. That includes driver's license, passports, credit cards, tickets, passenger manifests, things like that, where we're like, no, it says here that Betsy Bingle was sitting in seat 11F in the airplane. Well, that's only presumptive. That's not positive. It's presumptive because people change seats all the time in an airplane. When was the last time you booked a seat with your family or your friends or whatever, and you're like, I'd rather sit in the aisle seat. Why don't you take the window seat? And you swap seats, right? Or, hey, can I sit with my girlfriend? We couldn't get seats together. Do you mind swapping seats with me? And that sort of thing, with a total stranger. So presumptive IDs are just that. We're not sure if that's the person, but we're pretty sure. It gives us a starting point to then look for positive identification. I'll get way more into that later on, but just to tell you, there's no one place to look up dental records or prosthetic records or anything else. You literally have to find out who their dentist was first. And the only way you can do that is by having a presumptive idea of who you think this person was. Okay, as promised, Bertillon. Bertillon started this idea of anthropometry. Anthro, which means human, pometry. PO is just in there to flow, but metry means measurement, right? Like the metric system. Anthropometry is measuring the human body. So it started out with these kind of crazy devices that were used around about the end of the 19th century, like the 1890s, 1880s. They started measuring everything. You can see they had these crazy devices. That would be at a police station or, more often than not, in the entrance to prison. They would have these devices that they would stick on their heads and take all these different measurements of the individual. They would measure the length of their arms and legs and the length of their fingers and length of their nose and distance between their eyes, etc., etc., etc. Interestingly, a lot of what we do today is based on these same principles. But the Bertillon anthropometry had a few problems. It was great for a while until those films started coming out. Some of the drawbacks were as followed. First of all, not the same people were doing the same measurements. In fact, oftentimes they were using their own homemade devices or something else that was made by someone else that may have a lot of variation. So the instrument calibration was never really necessarily right, and the measurements themselves would be uh, given by the police or the jail guards or somebody like that who's taking these measurements, and they may not be very well trained. As you know, even today, our police force is not all that well trained. Most police forces in the United States only have a training period of about 150 to 160 days. You heard that right. 150 to 160 days is what most police officers spend in the police academy. Oftentimes they'll spend more. In certain jurisdictions they have much more. Others they have a little bit less. So on average it's about 160 days. It's not that much. And in so doing, of course, they're not going to cover everything, and they're certainly not going to cover these instruments. So one of the biggest problems was there was a lot of confusion. But the thing that drove the end of the Bertillon measurement system happened in 1903 in the United States at Leavenworth Prison. This is the Will West versus William West case. It is hilarious, and you hear me giggling already. The next slide is frankly going to blow your mind. First of all, May 1st, 1903, an African-American man named Will West was sent to Leavenworth Prison. He went through the Bertillon system. The identifying clerk matched his measurements and the photograph with those of a guy named William West, who has a previous conviction of murder. Well, Will West was like, oh, hell no, I've never murdered anybody. I don't know what you're talking about. And he's like, yeah, everybody who comes into this prison is innocent. We already have heard this a million times. But turns out in this very city, there's a guy named William West who committed murder, who was in prison in 1903. The problem was he was already there. They called over to the other prison and they said, hey, we've got William West. And they're like, nah, no, you don't. We have William West still. He's still here. He's still in his cell. He's been in his cell for over 3 years. At which point they went, wait, what? No, we have him here. He checked out. All the measurements were exactly the same. I mean, exactly the same. And his name is literally the same. William, come on. Turns out these two men, not related. Here you go. Can you tell the difference? Bet you can, because you're looking for it. But if you saw these two guys walking down the street and one of them passed you and then the other one passed you, you'd go, wait a minute. I just saw that guy. The one on the top is Will West. The one on the bottom is William West. They are not related, living in the same town, both got arrested, which isn't abnormal, especially for the time, and still not, because they're African American. There's a lot of institutionalized racism then as now. It was even worse then. In fact, over 99% of the prison population consisted in the United States, in most of the United States, consisted of black men, which is kind of indicative of institutionalized racism. So here you go. The Will West, William West case blew up. They went, wait a minute. Okay, the Bertillon system is fallible, which, by the way, at that time also included mugshots. These mugshots that you're looking at. The mugshots were supposed to be the last thing. So you take all these measurements in case there's a difference in the camera or anything like that, and then you slap a mugshot, put it in the system, and you're done. Well, the clerk was looking at the mugshot, looking at Will West, going, you're the same guy. Indeed, he wasn't. So, Will West, William West, two different people. What can we use to replace this? And what became used is now sort of the yardstick, the, the base comparison for everything, the fingerprint system. To this day, we compare most forensic things with fingerprints when we're describing how accurate or how inaccurate it can be. Turns out, as we'll meet in a few minutes, the fingerprinting system isn't all that accurate either, not because the idea of it doesn't work, because the usage of it, the people who are doing it, there's your weak link. It's always people. And we'll talk about how we're changing that as time goes on. Case led, obviously, to the widespread use of fingerprinting and the end of the Bertillon method, which is also useful because fundamentally, fingerprints are easier, quicker to get, and don't require any really high-end training. It's one thing. All you have to do is smear their fingers in ink, wipe the finger, place the finger in just the right way across the pad, and you're done. Nowadays, we don't even use ink anymore. But this system is pretty good. Fingerprints are relatively unique. You notice I'm using all of these qualifiers, right? Relatively unique. They're not perfect. And again, it's mostly because of people. But we'll talk about some of the issues with fingerprinting. So, forensics fundamentally looks at basic things. We're looking at the body. Almost all of what we work with in anthropology anyway is the bones and teeth. And some of the things that we look at right off the bat. Health. What kind of health was this person in during life? Obviously now they're dead, but before, when they were still alive, did they have a healthy upbringing? This is indicative of a lot of things and can help us narrow down a lot of other things. Stature. That means how big were they? Not only how tall they were, but also how wide they were. How built were they? What were they like? Obviously, age. This is sometimes a difficult one to narrow down. We'll talk about that much later on. Unique characteristics. These are great. If you have somebody with an abnormality, extra teeth, an extra digit, a growth here, a lack of growth there, a fusion here, a break, something like that. Traumas fall into these unique characteristics. Traumas include things like fractures, where I broke my arm, I broke my finger. By the way, a fracture means the same thing as break. You can't have a partial fracture any more than you can have a partial break, any more than you have a partially broken windshield on your car. It's either broken or it isn't. Fractures are breaks, same thing, means the same thing. Traumas also include things like gunshot wounds, stab wounds, cutting a body apart after they're dead, burning, all these things. And surgery actually falls into trauma. If you get a surgical procedure, it is traumatic to the body, no matter how you look at it, even if it's plastic surgery or anything else. And yes, we can tell. So we'll explain how we do those things as we go along. Not today. Data gathering methods that we use primarily. Anthroposcopy, which basically means looking, visual inspection of their skeleton, or as much of it as we have. Osteometry, osteo means bone. Osteometry means measurement of human bone. Chemical methods, which include things like DNA and strontium gathering and minute chemical analysis. And the last one, histology. We don't use this so much anymore, but histology, the study of the microscopic structure of the bones and teeth. In this, it's usually, of course, microscopic. Nowadays, we usually use scanning electron microscopes. Back in the older days, or if you don't have as much equipment in a given lab, you may take a very thin section, a slice, literally slice off a piece of bone and look at it under a microscope. And we can determine a lot of things, including age and health and some other issues with histology. Courts traditionally use one or two rules for admissibility of scientific evidence. The Frye test, which was Frye versus the United States in 1928. Frye versus the United States in 1928. What it was is essentially Mr. Frye said, look, I don't believe these forensic methods are as universal as you say they are. In other words, what they meant was, if one practitioner is taking fingerprints, and let's say they're comparing fingerprints and say, I need 10 points of similarity before I can say that fingerprint is from the same individual, these two latent prints. Whereas another one may say, I only need 6 or 3. Or how does one measure whether or not somebody was Hispanic or African American? What tests do they use? Which individuals are determining what these tests are? And if it's just an individual doing it, are they an expert in that field? Are they trained well enough for me to trust what they're saying? So the Fry test, way back in 28, was the first one that really started putting this scrutiny on forensic science and saying, you know what? Yeah, you say it's the same, but who are you? Are you just a guy, or are you well trained? If you're well trained, who agrees with you? Do all forensic scientists agree that this is enough evidence to prove that it's one thing versus another? This came up over and over and over again. There were people convicted and killed, put to death, based on some pretty shoddy evidence. Granted, most people thought they were the one who did it, but the evidence itself was questionable. And even today, when we go back with the scientific stuff that we have now, we go, yeah, that was probably wrong. They were probably falsely accused, or at least the evidence would not have held up anymore. And that is scary. Next came the Daubert test. Now, the Daubert test, as I mentioned, came up in the 1990s. It was Daubert versus Merrill Dow Pharmaceuticals, and the idea there was, again, hey, wait a minute. Even if this person has a scientific background, even if this person is ostensibly an expert in the field, how do you determine their expertise? Have they gone through the right training? Are they actually good? And are some scientists better than others? Of course. So the question then becomes, is this guy good enough? So after the Daubert test idea came into play in the 90s, everything was questioned. Everything had to be standardized. The Daubert test, by the way, is the one in which they started saying, well, the FBI, to make a fingerprint match, requires at least 16 points of similarity. Whereas in little Podunk, Georgia, they're only saying 3 because they're sure that's the guy that did it. Well, obviously, 3 is not the same as 16 points of similarity, and clearly there has to be some formality there. They have to say for fingerprints to be used, they have to measure up to at least something. And it has to, that standard has to be brought up by experts in the field. But even this has its problems. The Fry standard, the technique must be, quote, sufficiently established to have gained, quote, general acceptance in its particular field. That is way loosely defined. Sufficiently established according to whom? Well, apparently everybody in that particular field, but general acceptance, does that mean 50%? Over 50%? 30%? What's general acceptance? So that was the fundamental issue with the Fry ruling. Well, why does it say 23 now? It's 28. The Fry standard is not everybody agrees on sufficient evidence. Fingerprints, as I mentioned, FBI 16, state police sometimes 4, sometimes 3. There's got to be a measurement, an agreement there. The Daubert test, now they're saying, okay, you've got to consider more than one factor to assess scientific validity. Has the theory been tested? Has it been subjected to peer review, which is huge in science? you don't know what that is, you got some learning on science to do. What is the theory or technique's known or potential rate of error? In other words, how often does it get wrong? And is that theory or technique, here's where they fail again, generally accepted? Damn it. You'd think they would have learned on the front test, but they didn't. They still use this really bad legal term, generally accepted, which doesn't mean anything in legal terms. So there still is room for improvement. Here we are over 20 years, actually nearly 30 years on, where generally accepted needs to be readdressed to it's got to be accepted by a given board or something like that. And I'll talk about how we're addressing these things slowly because there's a lot of forensic science, but most of these things are being fairly well addressed. Not everybody agrees on peer review standards. What is generally accepted is too vague. And of course, the potential rate of error is also difficult to assess because not everybody's going to agree on the potential. There would be a large margin and a small margin. Most of them will go somewhere in the middle, but some will say higher, some will say lower. And what happens if you're within that margin? There's problems. States can choose between the tests. They can still decide whether or not they want to use Frye or Daubert. However, federal courts must use Daubert, which is why you see things go to the state Supreme Court, still get passed, and then move all the way up to the United States Supreme Court, and then it gets knocked down because it may pass the Frye standard, does not pass the Daubert standard. Findings of 2006 studies showed that many states use parts of Daubert, but still not all of it, meaning it's still a little skewed and way too slippery to literally hang your life on. Scary stuff. Which is better? Well, nobody really agrees. All standards have their failings, but law enforcement tend to use scientific methodology to maintain transparency. And the one thing about these tests is they force that to happen. They force law enforcement to say, okay, here is my open notebook. Here's what we did and why we came to our conclusions. And those can be questioned by any court and by the defense, which is important because that evens the playing field. Back in the day, it used to be like, well, our expert says that he did it, so he did it. Thankfully, now, there are more experts out there. There are a lot of disagreements between experts, and those disagreements can be grounds for dismissal. That is better. We in the United States a long time ago made the decision that it's better to let someone go who's guilty than to put somebody who's innocent behind bars, or worse, to death, which has happened a lot. So that's scary. For those of us who are law-abiding citizens, we're like, oh my God, I don't want to be thrown in jail and possibly put to death for something I never did, just because somebody thinks I did it. Scary stuff. That's why we tend to lean toward the presumption of innocence. But of course, racism raises its ugly head. Sexism raises its ugly head. Isms of all sorts. People have so many prejudices, and these prejudices continue with the jury of peers. The jury is also a bit of a weak point in our court system, and I'll explain that as we go on. Everybody agrees that lie detectors don't work. But here's the weird thing. Almost every police station either has one or uses the threat of the lie detector. It's an intimidation tactic. They also have really, really borderline torturous ways of, quote, interviewing people whom they think did it. That's scary stuff. If you interview somebody for something like 48 hours without giving them a rest, that's torture. So there's a lot of issues. Thankfully, Because of this scrutiny, all aspects of forensics are now closely monitored. Most branches have a qualifying process. The American Academy of Forensic Sciences, the AAFS, has in it a group of people, actually a huge group of people, that are absolute experts in forensics. It's a kind of a different way to get there, but you have to have certain background. And it's a big group. AAFS is a massive consortium of forensic scientists, and they have to agree on things. And they do so yearly. Anything new that comes up, they kind of work with, and then they revisit things that have been seen to be problematic in the past. Beyond that, there's the ABFA, the American Board of Forensic Anthropology. Now, these guys, the board members, who are called diplomats, are extremely well known and well done. This is a small group. I believe there's only 15 people in this group. I forget what the number is. It changes from time to time. But they are a group of people whom everybody agrees is an expert. This is like the Supreme Court of forensic sciences. What ABFA says goes. And most often, they are very conservative. In other words, if there are a lot of problems with a given test, it gets rejected, which is really good. All of this began with a guy named Wilton Krogman. Krogman started writing and teaching law enforcement about anthropology and how the body, he was actually a physician, but what he was looking at is the human body. He really started the ball rolling in what we now know as forensic anthropology. Fundamentally, he was teaching law enforcement how to look at bodies as evidence. This went on with William Maples. Bill Maples was kind of, if Krogman was the beginning person that started this, Bill Maples made it make sense. He standardized it. He formalized training for law enforcement and said, look, this is the way everybody has to do it so that when somebody in Louisiana looks up somebody who did the same thing in Georgia, now they're standardized. They're looking at the same thing. That was huge. Much of what Maples was doing was based on Krogman's study and writing. Now enter T.D.L. Stewart. T.D.L. Stewart is really known as the father of modern forensic anthropology. He finally took it out of a medical discipline and put it into the hands of the anthropologist. Here's why. Anthropologists know more about bones than anybody else. We can tell all sorts of things. What the bones can tell us and how they tell it, his statement, was what anthropology brings to the table. Forensic anthropology can tell you more about the individual who previously occupied those bones than any other group of people in the world. Forensic anthropology is all about bones. It's what we do. It's our strong point. Bill Bass, wonderful guy, took these steps a little further in standardization. Came up with the idea of the body farm. Now, he was in Tennessee, at the University of Tennessee, and he came up with this idea that, hey, 90% of the time when we find a body that's partially decomposed, we're finding this thing wrapped up in a weird blanket or stuffed in a car or dumped in a vat of acid or whatever. But to know how this affects the bone, to understand how the disposal of the body affects the deterioration and the rot, we have to do it in an experimental situation. So he came up with this idea called the body farm. Body farm where they literally put bodies out in the field in various ways. They bury them, they wrap them in blankets, they leave them in the back seat of a Ford, whatever. They put these things, like say in a Cadillac, you throw it in the back trunk of a Cadillac and close it up and then light the Cadillac on fire. How's that going to affect the body? Well, That's what the body farm is there for. At first, he obviously got a lot of scrutiny. A lot of people were like, not in my backyard. But now there are body farm copycats all over the place because here's the problem. Can I look at what happened in the back seat of my Cadillac that was on fire in Tennessee, say in the winter in Tennessee, gets quite cold, and compare that to what happens to the body that's put in the back of a Cadillac and set on fire in Louisiana? No, they're very different environments. The environment plays a massive role in decomposition. So it follows that obviously everywhere has to have one of these body farms to really figure out how all of it works. And the more places that are popping up body farms, the amount of stuff that we've learned since Bill started this. Bill started this body farm in the 1970s. And since it began, it has changed literally everything that we knew or we thought we knew about decomposition. The general idea, the goal of forensic anthropology is always to develop a biological profile, that is, a general description of the individual's, this is the dead person's, biology. What was the sex of the decedent? By the way, we don't say gender, we say sex, because you're born with it. Gender is what you decide. It's a social construct. You can change your gender all you want. Nobody cares. Well, people care, but it doesn't matter. What forensic anthropologists are looking at is what sex you were born with. And that can make a difference and can be a problem sometimes. Age of the decedent, how old they were at death. Ancestry of the decedent, notice we don't say what your nationality or what your ethnicity or anything like that. We use ancestry. Ancestry tells us who your parents were, what shapes we're looking for, to put it broadly. Stature. As I mentioned before, stature means height, size, build. Assessment of trauma. Whether that trauma happened before death, ante-mortem, after death, post-mortem, or the very intriguing one, perimortem, meaning at or around the time of death, meaning is that trauma associated with what killed this person? A lot of things involved there. And then, of course, we look at pathologies, including evidence of medical procedures or injury before this person was killed, or abnormalities, anything like that. These things can help narrow down who the individual was. Once we get the biological profile, then we start shifting into identification. Who was this individual? And then we can start building a case as to who was the last person that person saw, whom were they seen with last, etc., etc. Start narrowing down who might have done this. Fundamentally, as I alluded to before, most of what we do really revolves around osteology. That is the study of, you guys remember what osteo means? Bones. Study of skeletal remains. How many bones are there in the adult human body? 206 total. There are extra bones called sesamoids, supernumerary things like ribs and basic things like that, which can change things. But for the most part, the average adult human body has 206 bones. Here's a little quiz. This gets you thinking. Who has more bones, adults or children? I'll let you think about that for a minute. By the way, teeth, not bones. Teeth are teeth. They're made completely differently than bones are, but they are still in our realm of expertise. We know a lot about teeth. We can tell a lot about the individual's health, the individual's lifestyle, and in fact, how long the person lived to a greater or lesser extent using teeth. Osteology is fundamentally looking at bones, how bones are made, what they're made of. Bones are a lot more detailed than people think. People tend to think of bones as just a pile of something like calcium. They're a lot more than that. They're an organ. They're a living organ. They bleed. They heal. They change. They adapt. All sorts of things. Bones are far more detailed and far more instrumental in your day-to-day life than you may know. And we can tell an awful lot based on the bones and the surrounding tissue. 6 fundamental basic types of cases that we work on. Human versus non-human. This is 99% of what we do, especially, oddly enough, especially in big cities. City folk don't know what animal bones look like. So more often than not, we get either called out or it gets plopped on our desk, hey, is this human? That's literally the first question that we have to answer. Because 9 times out of 10, it is non-human, meaning it's deer or pig or something like that. That's the majority of what we get is non-human stuff, especially in cities. Country folk can recognize a deer bone much easier than city folk do. So when a person in the city goes to throw out their trash, opens up the trash can and sees a bunch of bones that look roughly human sized, oh my God, they call us. We come out, we look at it and go, oh, no, that's a deer. Or somebody had a pig roast. And that's all. That's all it is. Wet and dry cases. Wet meaning, of course, either underwater or something has been in water for a while. The reason there is because that tends to cause the soft tissues of the body to leave the body fairly quickly. In which case, we get called in whenever it's skeletonized or mostly skeletonized. Dry cases are, again, things like skeletons and mummies. These tend to take a little longer. Believe it or not, mummies, you don't have to be living in Egypt to encounter a mummy. People put bodies in things all the time. As long as that body is protected from insects and scavengers, it'll mummify. The soft tissue will desiccate, it'll dry out, and it'll shrink, and it'll look just like a mummy, because it is a mummy. Decedent searches, mostly what that is when we're called out. If somebody finds some bone in an area or something like that, and they bring it to us and we determine it to be human bone, then we'll go out to that same place. Usually law enforcement will take us out there and we will start looking. We look with our trained eye. We know what bones look like. Like I mentioned, we are experts in bone. So we go out and we can see a bone where other people thought maybe that's not a bone. So that's usually what we do. We go out and re-police the area and make sure that we get everything. We usually find quite a bit more. And we also grab some other things, and I'll talk about that later on. Skeletal remains, surface field recovery, of course, this is us too. If they find a skeleton on just laying on the surface, or if it's buried or burned, we also get called in. The last thing, which apparently didn't make the slide, is teeth. It's on there, but I guess it got pushed down a little bit. Teeth. If people find just individual teeth, usually that's not enough to spark an investigation unless they find something else, like corroborating evidence, like there was definitely a murder here. But here's some teeth. And that's all we've got. But we've got, blood everywhere and hair and all this other stuff. Then we usually get called out to examine the teeth to determine what we can figure out. There's a few more things that we do, but these are the basic cases which we get called out. Most of the other cases, which in my parlance I say still have the gushy bits on them. All the pieces that still have enough of the body left, then it goes to the medical examiner. The medical examiner works either is the same thing as the coroner. Like, for example, here in LA, we have a coroner/medical examiner who are trained physicians who look at the body. So that is body with its skin on. Surprisingly, in big cities, the vast majority of bodies that are found still have a lot of skin on them. That's because it's a big city. There's not a lot of places to hide that people don't walk by all the time and either smell it or see it and then call the authorities. So there you go. This is something that would make a great exam question. Most of what we talked about probably won't be on exam, but man, this might. The body is the best evidence. Think about it. You can have all sorts of evidence, but if you have the body, it literally tells the story to the trained eye of what happened to it? There's that famous line from the Pirates of the Caribbean, dead men tell no tales. Well, interestingly enough, Bill Maples' first book was Dead Men Do Tell Tales. That was his name of the first book, which actually came out a little bit after the Pirates of the Caribbean ride. But anyway, the idea there is that we can read, essentially, a skeleton and find out an awful lot about what happened to this individual, who that individual was, and where the killer might have gone wrong. The last thing that is in yellow here is something that is in our forte. It's in our area. It's what we do. And that is we determine manner of death. Manner of death means, was it homicide, suicide, accidental, natural, or unknown, which I think is a total cop-out, but whatever. That is, we determine whether they were murdered, suicide, or one of the others, which will usually, not always, but usually take it out of the realm of forensics. Those are all manner of death. It is not cause of death. Cause of death would be something like, well, yeah, Mrs. Kennedy, a bullet went into his brain and knocked most of his brains out of his skull. JFK was murdered. That was the manner of death, homicide. The cause of death was massive trauma to the brain. Does that make sense? The cause of death is always decided by the medical examiner. Sometimes they can't give a cause of death because there's no soft tissue left. We can say, oh yeah, this guy was shot in the head from behind, probably homicide. But that's still manner of death if it's found as a skeleton and the medical examiner cannot look at any of the organs and determine what actually caused the death. They will say undetermined. So it can be that you can have homicide undetermined on a forensics report. That is because it's done by two separate branches of science. So our purview is manner of death, not cause of death. We'll talk much more about that later on. Forensic anthropologists know more about the bones than anyone else on Earth. That's just what we do. It's literally the main focus of our entire career. Crimes involving charred bodies, mass graves, skeletonized remains, acid disposal, long burial, long exposure, meaning not buried, usually on the surface, mummification, and teeth. Even though mummification still includes a lot of the soft tissue, it has been mummified, it has been desiccated, dried out. That falls into our area more so than the area of the medical examiner. So these are the types of cases that we work in the most. Does that make sense? All right. Next episode, we'll start going into some more detail on some of these things, and we'll start talking about how we do what we do.